Hi, I'm Mark Lynch, Director of the Project on Middle East Political Science and the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University. Welcome back to the POMEPS Conversations, our series of chats with leading scholars in the field. With me today is Raffaele Lefevre, a doctoral candidate at the University of Cambridge and a visiting fellow at the Carnegie Endowment, and the author of a truly outstanding book, Ashes of Hama, one of the first real histories of the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Mark.
So I thought it would be interesting to talk about the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood. And can you say a little bit about the role that they've played in the Syrian uprising and in the war that's unfolded? How have they fit into this picture of Syrian opposition?
So the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria, just like in Tunisia and other countries, has been in exile for a long time. So it wasn't back in Syria at the time of the uprising. It had to work very hard to gain a measure of influence on the Syrian uprisings. It did so through different ways. First, it took a leading role in the Syrian opposition, first the Syrian National Council and then the National Coalition. It tried to do some work on the ground inside Syria in rebel-held areas, doing some humanitarian work. It started a series of militias as well, trying to gain influence on the Syrian rebel scene. But that was, unfortunately for them, very unsuccessful because at that point in time, a year and a half, 2 years ago, the extremists in Syria were on the rise and they posed a serious challenge to the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood.
Well, how did they get such a role in the exiled opposition if they didn't have a presence on the ground?
I mean, the Syrian exile opposition is an exile opposition, so it's made up of mainly a lot of people who have been outside of Syria for the past 20 or 30 years, mainly since the repression of the 1980s between Hafez al-Assad, the father of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, and the Islamist opposition at the time led by the Muslim Brotherhood. So it wasn't that hard for them 3-4 years ago because they were so influential in exile to take a leading role in the Syrian opposition.
Now, your book shows the very deep roots of the Muslim Brotherhood before 1982, and actually your discussion of the period of the late 1970s into the early 1980s, it really shows that it wasn't just that but Hafez al-Assad went in and leveled Hama. There was a lot more to it than that. Where did the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood fit in Syrian politics in that period? If you go back to the late 1970s up to 1982.
So the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, like other Muslim Brotherhood branches in the region, has had a very tumultuous history. It's gone from being a secret political party to becoming involved in parliamentary politics in the 1950s, to becoming repressed after 1963 and the seizure of power by the Ba'ath Party, and thus going underground, radicalizing, and then it took a leading role in the Islamist uprisings of the early 1980s. Its main stronghold was in Hama, but it also was quite influential in Damascus and in Aleppo. This is in very stark contrast to the situation today in Syria, in which most of the rebels actually come from the countryside. Well, back in the late 1970s, the Muslim Brotherhood had its stronghold in the main cities of Syria, not in the countryside. And again, this struggle between countryside and city is one of the main features of Syrian politics, of Middle Eastern politics in general, and it's playing its role in the current uprisings.
So when Hafez al-Assad went and he crushed the movement, then they are dispelled. Where do they go for the most part, the leaders and the ones who aren't killed?
At first, most of them went to Jordan and to Iraq, then to Saudi Arabia, many of them, and increasingly to the West. That was the picture before the uprisings. But when the uprising started, most of these people regrouped in Istanbul, in Turkey, and some of them went back to Syria. So that's the picture as it stands today.
Then the role they played in the uprising, you said they were active in the exile groups. What about in terms of media, information, the early propaganda efforts? Did they have a role in that as well?
Absolutely, but more on an individual basis. The organization didn't push a sort of organized move in terms of trying to build up a media or, for instance, to give a concrete example, the Syrian Revolution Facebook page was started by a few Syrian Muslim brothers, but independently from the leadership. So the youth in particular was active on an individual basis without the blessing of the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood in all of these different fields.
Now, where do the youth come from? If the movement's been in exile for 20 years, and it's highly repressed on the ground. What is the source of Syrian Muslim Brotherhood youth?
So there are two kinds of youth. The first one are people who left Syria in the early 1980s when they were 15, 16, 17 years old. Very often they had parents who were Syrian Muslim brothers. The second generation was actually born in exile from very often Syrian Muslim brothers. Both parents were active in the organization, and therefore, I mean, for the past 30 years in exile, they were active very often in Islamic groups in their host communities, for instance, campaigning in favor of Muslim rights in Europe. But when the uprising started, many of them became active again in the organization and went back to Syria.
So in many ways, the uprising actually was almost a rebirth.
Absolutely.
For the movement.
Absolutely.
Now, how has the, you mentioned the radicalization of some of the youth and the rise of extremist groups. How has the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood reacted to the rise of ISIS and al-Nusra and all of these competing groups? At the organizational level, but also at the level of these youth that you're talking about?
That's an interesting question, because the Muslim Brotherhood traditionally has always talked about the creation of a caliphate, the ummah, the gathering of the Muslim communities throughout the world. This was always a talk about ideology, didn't have any concrete implication, but when the Islamic State became on the rise a few years ago, when it declared the caliphate last June, it posed a serious ideological challenge to the Muslim Brotherhood, which was at the leadership level quite moderate, talking about democracy, talking about a Syrian state, being nationalist. But at the roots, in terms of the education of the people on the ground, there was a serious gap that widened when the caliphate was declared, because the Islamic State has been fairly successful in terms of providing a certain kind of governance in rebel-held areas. Nusra has been doing that as well. We've talked a little bit less about that, but it's always been on the rise in the past 3 years. So these groups have posed a serious ideological challenge to the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, as some of the youth is starting to leave the Brotherhood for more extremist organizations.
So you see a lot of that, of people leaving?
There is a trend. There is a trend. Whether this is becoming a majority trend or whether this is still a minority, I think is a matter of time, but there is a trend. But there is also another challenge, which is more organizational, as you suggested. The Syrian Muslim Brotherhood is still controlled by a handful of people who have been active in the leadership since the 1980s. These are people who are 75, 80, 85 years old and are giving orders to 18, 20, 25 years old people. Some of these people have become very frustrated by this situation and thus are leaving the group for more active, dynamic Islamist groups. Some of them are extremist.
Now, I know it's not your focus, but how would you characterize the relationship between the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood and other Muslim Brotherhood organizations, whether in Egypt or elsewhere? Are they well connected, or are they really just doing their own?
That's an interesting question, because for a long time Bashar al-Assad in Syria was a fairly consensual figure in the Middle East, because he was supporting the so-called Islamic resistance agenda against Israel. So that meant that a lot of Muslim Brotherhood branches in the region actually supported the Syrian regime because of its fight against Israel. That put the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood on the margins of the regional Muslim Brotherhood network. Ever since the uprisings, of course, the situation changed, but it's still struggling to make use of these networks of Muslim Brotherhood branches. It's not seen really as a credible force by other Brotherhood branches, because it's been in exile for the past 30 years, and because most of its work is actually prevented from within by serious infighting between factions.
Great. So you for the last few years, you've actually been working on a different project. You've been living in Tripoli. You've been doing research for your dissertation. Tell me a little bit about what you're seeing there on the ground.
So I was based in Tripoli, Lebanon, not Tripoli, Libya,
of course.
because the situation is very different there. The situation was also difficult in Tripoli, Lebanon, but it was very interesting for a range of reasons. I started living there about a year and a half ago. When I first came there, the situation was the following. The Syrian opposition was on the rise. The moderates were still pretty influential. But the situation changed both in Syria and in Lebanon, with Hezbollah becoming more and more influential in the politics, in the security realm in Lebanon, but also in Syria. This radicalized a number of young Sunnis, and I've been witnessing this Sunni radicalization very prominently in the past year.
What do you see? Like, what are the things that tell you that radicalization is going on?
Well, the Islamic State is on the rise. The Nusra Front is active. People are leaving moderate Sunni political parties such as the Future Movement or the Lebanese Muslim Brotherhood as well. They're leaving these parties and joining more and more extremist organizations because of their political frustration, because of the situation in Syria. Some of them have gone and fought with the Islamic State and Nusra in Syria. Some of them have returned and want to stage attacks in Lebanon. But I think there has also been a theme that many people haven't fully grasped with, which is the socio-economic marginalization of Sunni communities in the Levant. These are areas, Sunni areas such as Tripoli, which have been struggling in terms of the economy, very much struggling with the Syrian refugee inflow, of course, but also traditionally these have been marginalized provinces.
And March 14th, the Future Movement, groups like that, you don't think are doing a good job of representing or advocating for these communities?
I think the ideals of the March 14 coalition, which are, for instance, the rejection of the Syrian regime, are still very popular. But what we are seeing is a rapprochement between some of these parties that belong to the March 14, the Future Movement, the Kataeb, others, and the Syrian regime, Hezbollah, March 8. There is right now a coalition government between the two forces, and this is not very popular with the strongholds of the March 14 movement.
So you see things getting more and more polarized?
Absolutely. I mean, some statistics are telling the Lebanese domestic political and sectarian scene are becoming more and more polarized. 80% of the Shiites in Lebanon support Hezbollah's intervention in Syria, whereas only 6% of the Sunnis support this intervention. So Hezbollah and its role both in Lebanon and in Syria has really polarized Lebanese politics, but also Lebanese society.
All right, well, I'd like to thank you for joining us. Raffaele Lefevre, author of Ashes of Hama and a visiting fellow at the Carnegie Endowment. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Mark.